I very warmly welcome you tonight on, as Manhattan has told me, Cinco de Mayo, where most people are celebrating something in samba. We are celebrating as well. We are celebrating the 200th birthday of Karl Marx, which for us is an extraordinary event. Almost 30 years after the collapse of the communist bloc of the Warsaw Pact and the reunification of Germany, in the last week, I noted that especially German media are discussing this issue Karl Marx very intensively. Hundreds of new books have been published in the last month, and the discussion is really wide and getting back, trying to get back to the essence of the work of Karl Marx, which most of them he published with this England, and bring it out of the struggle of the Cold War, where there were the pro-Marx communists on the east side and the anti-Marx capitalists on the other side, and all views on Karl Marx were narrowed. Now we have the chance now to reconsider it and to analyze and examine the ideas of Karl Marx for the 21st century. And that's why we initiated this symposium here, Marx NOW it is called. Our program is concentrated on this symposium, but we also have some interesting films that we are going to be screened throughout the next week. Next Sunday, there is a marathon screening of about 7 hours of an epic work of Alexander Kluge, which is called News from the Ideological Antiquity, where in his exceptional documentary way he tries to get closer to the relation of Karl Marx, Sergei Eisenstein, and Kunkel. And in the weekend afterward, there will be a program at Anthology Film Archive with some international productions on the life and work of Karl Marx. I don't want to miss to draw your attention to this, our Marx NOW, which is called not Marx NOW, but Marx Here, where together with our friends from the Goethe-Institut for Social Research, we identified 14 spaces in Lower Manhattan, which are in a way related to the ideas of Karl Marx, and which makes it even historically evident that Marx is a New York issue. So if next weekend or the weekend afterwards you have time to stroll around in Lower Manhattan, look for these places and take one of these maps, and tell your friends who are not here that they should come here and pick up one of these maps. It's not online, only physical. But we have a website as well, which you find under Marx NOW. There are other information which you can find there. Now, that's a preliminary welcome. Let's go to content and let's talk about Karl Marx. One thing's left. Thank you to all the friends who helped us organize this program, especially the Goethe-Institut for Social Research, Anthology Film Archive, and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And now it's your turn. Ajay, Singh, Chaudhary. Yeah, okay. He will introduce the panel. Thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
Thank you to our friends at the Goethe-Institut. Thank you to all my colleagues at the Goethe-Institut for Social Research who've been planning this for quite some time. Thanks to all of our guest panelists for this evening and for the whole weekend. And thank you all for coming. My name is Ajay Chaudhary, as Chiara mentioned. I'm the Executive Director of the Goethe-Institut for Social Research. I'm also a member of our core faculty specializing in social and political theory. And for those of you who don't know, Brooklyn Institute for Social Research is a critical education and research institute based here in New York, but now also offering seminars in 6 states, national programming, all kinds of stuff. You can find out about us on the internet. I won't get further into it here. And I'm both going to sort of give my little intro spiel and also at the same time fold in the intro spiel for this discussion. So without further ado. On this day, May 5th, 1818, Karl Marx was born in the small Prussian town of Trier. And ostensibly, that's what brings us together this evening, and dozens, perhaps hundreds, of similar events, celebrations, and commemorations the world over. It wouldn't have been clear in, say, 1991, that even if this anniversary was to be remembered at all, it would be anything more than a historical curiosity. Once, the tradition of this dead German Jew weighed on the brain for the living like a nightmare. But now we live in the sunny eternity of the liberal capitalist end of history. Forever and ever, amen. For nearly a generation of thinkers, activists, and politicians, 1989, the wake of the Cold War, Marx seemed to be a dead letter. Even for many on the left, Marx and Marxism, perhaps an embarrassing legacy to overcome. And yet, with decades of the ever-increasing concentrations of global wealth, unraveling social and political systems, ecological catastrophe, technological acceleration, and broad systemic exhaustion, Marxist ideas and politics, Marxian analyses and challenges have come back to the fore. Instead of simply commemorating the 200th year of Marx's birth, we come together pointedly to ask, why Marx now? In this way, 1818 is not the only date that could frame this conversation. Just this past year, it was the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and next year will be the 100th anniversary of the death of Rosa Luxemburg. Or perhaps we should be thinking of 1946, decolonization, the Chinese Revolution, or 1929, the Great Market Crash, the Great Depression, and here in the United States, particularly here in New York City, the Radical 30s. It's also the 150th birthday of W.E.B. Du Bois. It's a mere 70 years since Paul Robeson was blacklisted, 50 years since 1968, and just under 40 years since the right introduced its own new dream world for the end of the millennium and beyond. Unfettered freedom and incalculable political enforcement for accumulation and domination, test-driven in the third world and brought home to roost. As many late 19th century Marxists themselves had thought, the clockwork mechanisms of history had proven them right. It wasn't simply another political program claiming to be better. Rather, this was the judgment of history. There was no alternative. Since the financial crash of 2008, another year to consider, Marx has returned, not only to political and scholarly discussion on the left, but his hirsute visage quite suddenly graces the unlikely pages of the Financial Times and The Economist, or the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg News. In the belly of the last cold warrior standing, a majority of adults under the age of 30 identify as explicitly anti-capitalist. A specter, it would seem, is haunting the world, whispering that perhaps there are only alternatives, that another world is possible, that far from ending, history is just about to begin. Is the old dying? Can the new be born? That Marx should be neither dogma nor dead letter is perhaps our gambit for this symposium. Over the course of this weekend's discussions and sessions on political identity, ecology, technology, economics, slavery, gender, aesthetics, policy, and more, organizers and scholars, activists and artists will probe just how far Marxian analyses, ideas, and politics can take us in the 21st century. And tonight, it's our task at this. Is Marx a dead letter? Why Marx now? Every one of our distinguished panelists has selected a bit of writing from Marx's corpus that they wager is vital or germane to our present moment. It is less than 200 years since Marx proposed that it wasn't timeless truths, lofty ideals, or eternal morals, but rather the simple processes of people seeking out the material wants, needs, and desires of everyday life, the shifting methods of the human branch of nature carving out our own natural niche that gave shape, form, and character to our world. Tonight, looking back to Marx's writings and each of our discussants' reflections, we'll see just how much life is left in these old letters yet. So, without further ado from me, and brief introduction of the rest of the panel, and we're still waiting for one guest, so I'm hoping you come. And I'll do this in the order in which I think folks will speak, if that's okay. To my right is Drucilla Cornell. These are abbreviated. I think you can find longer versions in printouts. Drucilla Cornell is Emeritus Professor of Political Science, Women's Studies, and Comparative Literature at Rutgers University, a renowned scholar of feminist theory, critical legal studies, philosophy, and politics. To my left is Akuno. He's the director of Cooperation Jackson, which is an emerging network of worker cooperatives and supporting institutions. Cooperation Jackson is fighting to create economic democracy by creating a vibrant solidarity economy in Jackson, Mississippi that will help transform Mississippi and the South. To my further right, this is not a political thing, by the way. To my further right, again, not a political thing, is McKenzie Wark. He's the author of A Hacker Manifesto, General Intellects, and various other things. Wark teaches, and I'm embellishing here again, quite a lot of things, but especially media, at the New School in New York City. Next to him is Benjamin Kunkel, who is a founder of M+1, is the author of Indecision, a novel, Buzz, a play, Utopia or Bust, a collection of essays on contemporary left thinkers, and he writes for the London Review of Books and Salvage, amongst other places. Chiara Bottici, to my left, is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research. She is author of Imaginal Politics, Images Beyond Imagination and the Imaginary, A Philosophy of Political Myth, and Men and States. And finally, I could get my... Thanks, sorry. Anwar Shaikh, who's right here to my left, is a professor of economics at the Graduate Faculty of Political and Social Science of the New School University. Associate editor of the Cambridge Journal of Economics from 2000 to 2005, senior scholar and member of the macro modeling team at the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College. His most recent book is Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, Crises. So, please welcome our guests.
Not at all. Can you hear me?
Because you got to use the mic.
I actually brought the book. It's an old-fashioned characteristic, I know, to quote from books, but I was asked to do a sentence, and my sentence is from the Grundrisse, Alienation of the Conditions of Labor with the Development of Capitalism is an Inversion. The inversion is the foundation of the capitalist mode of production, not only its distribution. Now, I turn to the Grundrisse for two reasons. First of all, when I grew up in the 1970s, Althusser dominated. Marx was not a humanist. He had no interest in alienation. He had no interest in achieving an ethical, democratic society. It was all about science and structuralism. This became super cool. And the one thing you didn't do is read Hegel. So I devoted the next 6 years of my life to reading Hegel's Science of Logic in total rebellion because, in fact, there is no evidence whatsoever, and this book is evidence to the opposite, that Marx was just a scientist who was an economist, as dry as they come. No offense to the economists, my ex-husband is one. As dry as they come, who had some scientific laws to say about how capitalism would collapse. That's not Marx. Marx is about alienation. Marx is about exploitation. Marx is about how more and more people will become completely deprived of anything like their creative capacities as their own. And anyone who's an academic, and if you are adjuncts or my students desperately striving for a job, you know that the collegium capital corporation distinction has completely collapsed. We will see the end of tenure in the next 10 years, and you will be people who no longer have what tenure was, which is a kind of ownership over your creative capacity. It's going to end. Now, hopefully we, like the British students and the British professors, will strike and fight back, and that will not be possible. The only way it's not going to be possible is if we strike and fight back. Now, so is Marx relevant today? Yes. What we're seeing is in volume 3 of Capital, the horrific financialization of all work ethics, where, as Rosa Luxemburg will later tell us, the accumulation of capital becomes in fewer and fewer hands. The result is militarism. The result is inevitable imperial domination, and we are seeing that at every step of our day-to-day life. Marx has never been more relevant. There will never be a society where human beings live together in peace and dignity until capitalism comes to an end. Now, given that, the scientificization of Marx, which the Grundrisse clearly shows never happened, is part of turning a revolutionary thinker into someone who can get you tenure at Harvard. As long as you don't think that, you'd be really super cool and out yourself thinker, throw out a lot of jargon, and people say, hey, you're cool, But if you dare to say that you are a thinker who demands the end of the inhumane world we are living in, okay, you're going to be in trouble. But you know what? It's worth it to be in trouble. It really is worth it to be in trouble. I was kicked out of Stanford, fired from Columbia as a union organizer, arrested when I got my job back as from the National Labor Relations Board, a board we don't really have anymore. And I have no regrets. I did armed self-defense for the Black Panther Party. I had no regrets, and I became a law professor. And perhaps that is a sign of the cunning of reason. Why Marx is relevant to us is not just about the absolutely crucial analysis in the 3 volumes of Capital about why capitalism is inherently exploitative at the level of production. All theories of justice, with all the greatness and respect I have for John Rawls, are about distribution. They do not touch the complete re-engagement with how work and production and a world without the extraction of surplus value would be possible. And until we figure this out, and we're not going to figure it out in this room or me, we're going to figure it out in practice, we are not going to get to anything like socialism. As Rosa Luxemburg, who told us socialism lies in the midst of the future, and that's why we need, in any socialist claimed society, the most sweeping forms of participatory democracy, which would end anyone being thrown beneath the bar of what it means to be human. That's what Marx is about. That's what Marxism is about, and that's the future of socialism that probably many of us in this room are fighting for. The great utopian thinker Ernst Bloch told us that there's a cold stream in Marxism, and this is why nobody in his mind, the Communist Party, could answer Hitler. Because accumulated rage was for him exactly what takes place of a mobilized left that understands that accumulated rage, unlike Hillary Clinton, is not about people being dumb, not about people not going to Yale, not about people not getting straight A's at Harvard. It's about people having no decent jobs. It's about the absolute destruction of the right to strike and the union movement that was the basis of this country, of what was called the quote-unquote middle class. And people don't have decent jobs anymore. They have no access to health insurance. As I'm sure many of you, I'm a single mother putting a child through college. what on earth does it mean for someone to pay $63,000 to get an MFA at Columbia University? My daughter was taken on the wait list. Thank God she didn't get in. Because the instructors don't show up, and 51 out of 54 students are demanding their tuition back. What does that say when that university has a, I mean, of course they fired me as a union organizer, so I don't like them very much. But $10 billion endowment, and the president of that university makes over $5 million a year. Come on, guys, it's time to hit the streets and say we will not accept it anymore. And so Ernst Bloch says, when we look at the not yet of consciousness, the future, we're making it up. It's not something in the past. It's not something based in scientific laws. As he puts it, hope unfurls banners, but it's up to us to pick them up. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. You know, I found this quote piece a bit challenging. When the task was initially kind of given to us. No, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Because for me, it made me kind of think a little bit more, think a little bit deeper. And part of it is a personal piece. Like when I write outside of giving an introduction or a closing, I tend to never want to quote anybody. I always found it to be a little bit too doctrinaire, right? And sometimes an evasion of actually trying to provide a real analysis of the concrete situation that's confronting you in the here and now. So this made me kind of go back. And there's two things, there's two of them that really struck me that I thought would be somewhat relevant to discuss today, that is definitely relevant to my work in the work I'm trying to involve in to help transform the world. The first one is one I think most folks in this audience might know, which is the simple, labor in the white skin can never free itself as long as labor in the black skin is branded. I think I come back to that one because where significant sections of the Black liberation movement are now, I think, have somewhat forgotten this dictate. And we can come to that a little bit later, maybe sometime over the weekend. And then the second one, this is one which has really been an inspiration to me on a couple of different levels. And this is from the critique of the Goethe program. In the highest stage of communist society, after the servitude of subordination to division of labor has disappeared, and with it the opposition between mental and physical labor, after labor has become not only a means of life, but the primary need of life, after each individual's productive power has increased with his all-around development and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more freely, only then can the narrow limits of bourgeois right be wholly left behind. And can society inscribe upon its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Now, that particular piece has always been an aspirational piece for me as to, what am I working, trying to build, what am I sacrificing for? And for me, it's always been a measure of kind of evaluating where, at least the era that I am a part of, that we are a part of, where it is relative to being able to meet all of society and human needs, and where this aspect of justice, where the gaps are between each one. I would argue that I think we've been at this place for most of, since at least the middle part of the 20th century. the ability to actually meet everyone's kind of basic material needs, that's been conquered some time ago. It's been conquered at a price, and that price is we might all perish under the method and means of extraction and exploitation and extraction that have been perfected over that period of time, because it's actually killing Mother Earth. But the basic ability to be able to take care of folks' basic fundamental needs, that piece was conquered. But it didn't mean that the methods and means and the revolutionization of technology slowed down. It's actually accelerated and sped up. And we now exist pretty much in a world that should financial capital make a real pivot, and they haven't fully made this decision yet, and something I think we can debate. But should they decide to pivot towards automation, full automation, and AI, almost all of us in this room will be immediately irrelevant within a 10 to 20 year period. And that's something we need to grapple with. And so for me, the first quote speaks to what I call kind of a canary in the gold mine. It's this notion that I've been arguing about black disposability. And that the black working class fundamentally has become totally irrelevant to the productive process in the United States. And that's not something I'm saying is exclusive just to black people, just to be clear. I'm just saying that we're a canary in the mine. This is something that already exists in large parts of the world. But if you look at the so-called first world, we're one of the first populations that kind of meet a certain criteria. And it's an issue primarily about the survivability of black people, but it's an issue in the warning that goes to that first quote about we all better get our shit together or else we're all going to be pretty much eliminated. Elon Musk and some of his buddies might enjoy their trip to Mars, but the rest of us will be, down here suffering in squalor if we do not expropriate the expropriators quick. So part of what we've been trying to work on is the other part of this quote, right? Now, I'm a science fiction nerd and buff, and I like my little dreams of, fully automated luxury communism, right? I don't like the way that sounds, but what it pretends I do have an appreciation for. But the critical piece to me is we have to figure out, and I think we are at a place in human society, in human development, we can actually do production in a far different way. But we can meet material needs, but we can also reduce our footprint on planet Earth at the same time, and also do some regenerative things. Now, it's going to take a lot of profound shift in our own thinking amongst the left, I think, to get us there. Then it's going to take a tremendous battle with capital to win who's going to actually direct the future of humanity. And for us, I think we have to settle on the fact that I would argue we either decide to win it or we settle on the sixth extinction. The choice is really that clear to me. So I don't mean to leave folks on a down note, but just to have a clear understanding of what our task actually is. I do think we have the capacity to do it. I just think there's still a certain level of clarity and urgency that is somewhat missing, at least from the organized left, to be able to be a catalyst, I think, to those folks who are the vast majority of humanity, which are completely enraged at the system right now. And I think not just waiting for a critical breakthrough, but waiting for us to catch up to the resistance which is already being mounted.
Ken? Thank you, Ajay. I'd like to start with a famous line from the Communist Manifesto. All that is solid melts into air, all that is sacred is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. Now, there's a lot going on in that line, and by teasing out some of those things out, I hope to offer a way of thinking about the question, why Marx now?
All that is solid melts into air. It probably actually sounds better in English than German. You know, I'm not a Germanist, but from what I can tell. It's like we can translate it how we want, yeah? Like it's become its own thing. It conjures up an image of the industrial era, of steam power, smokestacks, and yet it also speaks the language of chemistry, a science just becoming modern when it was written. It also suggests that the solidity of tradition is evaporating, a world of supposedly closely connected community is giving way to one of free-floating atoms. All that is sacred is profaned. A religious worldview extruded out of an now obsolete mode of production finds itself overtrod at every step by modes of calculation that have nothing to do with the ancient verities. Tradition is giving way. The forces of production are bursting through the old constraints and showing old, obscure habits of thought not to be eternal truths for all time. And man is at last forced to face with sober sense his real conditions of life. Can we say humans instead? The translation says man. Let's say humans. Man is still thinking, Marx is still thinking of our species being, the way he learned it from Feuerbach, as something that has an essence. And that all of the religious world is but an inverted projection of the qualities of that essence. The destruction by capitalism of the basis of those beliefs is their real undoing. Conditions of life is a pregnant phrase here. The conditions of life are social labour, wresting freedom from necessity, socializing nature just as it naturalizes the social, abolishing artificial forms and producing social wealth. Or so it could be. The real critique of the present is not in any argument so much as to the fact that social production does not actually produce social wealth for all, and his relations with his kind. The melting into air of the old beliefs under the blowtorch of development of the forces of production reveals the means by which the production of social wealth by social labour is turned instead into misery and precarity. All that is solid melts into air, all that is sacred is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. The forward momentum of capital, its inherent dynamism, may have shredded the last relics of the old order, but they did not then stand naked and revealed to a sober sense. On the contrary, it produced instead its own modes of intoxication. One thing that's very significant about this text, however, is that Marx and Engels do not hold capital to account according to even more ancient rights and charters. They are not looking backwards. There may be many things about this emerging world that they admire. They value reason, scientific method, cosmopolitan values, modern communication. How can the potential of these things be realized as general and social attributes of a way of life for all? What agent could be the bearer of those values? Not capitalists who proclaim a universality that quickly reveals itself to be partial and one-sided once the question of property is raised. As Marx and Engels say elsewhere in the manifesto, the real forces for change are those who ask the property question. Nor do they see themselves or their kind as agents of change per se. Ideas don't make and remake the social world. The social world makes and remakes ideas. An abstract idea requires an abstract agent. Capital has blown apart the local and particular, the provincial and superstitious, and all the petty little emollients and subventions of small-minded aristocratic ruling classes. But it's also destroyed the local and particular, the solid and unchanging ways of life of a peasantry. It's thrown them off their land into the Moloch moor of industrial labour. Now, with nothing to lose but its chains, labour becomes a potential bearer of an ever more abstract form. I have a small confession to make here. My loyalty is more to the working class than to Marx. I was raised in the labour movement. I was taught Marx at party school. Marxism was always a little vulgar, as you can already tell. I take the most enduring feature of Marxism to be this, the point of view of the working class. To me, Marxism has no essential method or dogma or theory other than that. So when asked why Marx now, I don't think the answer lies in a return to a philosophy or method or dogma that was current in a small world of even cosmopolitan radical thinkers in the middle of the 19th century. All that is solid melts into air, all that is sacred is profaned, and that surely includes some of the verities of classical Marxism. This brings us to the interesting question as to what and where the working class is now, however. Marx recognised, thanks to Engels' psychogeographic work in Manchester, that the industrial working class was displacing the artisan and the craft worker. But it's not the case that this became a universal form of labour, nor has the global distribution of labour stood still. There are probably more industrial workers in China now than there are people in the whole of the British Isles. Industrial work is not quite the same, given how closely woven into the production process information is these days. Marx wrote the manifesto with the aid of concepts appropriated from German philosophy. He wrote Capital with intellectual resources that included the latest thermodynamic and metabolic concepts from physics, chemistry, the life sciences, not to mention careful ethnographies of industrial technology from Charles Babbage. But no science of information existed in his time. What labour is after the instrumentalising not just of physics and chemistry, but biology and information science seems to me an open question. So what would a critique not just of the science of political economy, but a critique of those other sciences be? Labour now has to be thought as including not just social production, but also social reproduction, including unpaid labour, affective labour, and sex work, a topic on which Marx was still rather moralistic. Maybe not all of labour is strictly speaking even human, other species do it too. If labour fills standardised labour processes with content, perhaps we need a way of thinking also those whose labour is not to produce standard content but novel forms. So-called innovation and creativity are now commodified in quite novel ways. The enclosure of the information commons is a major front in class struggles of a distinctly 21st century type. But let's not forget that while the planet may now be made up of a majority of urban dwellers, many still work the land. The enclosure of the land proceeds in attenuated form. If Marxism is the point of view of the working class, high on its agenda remains the question of alliances with other exploited classes, not to mention tactics for negotiating with other classes. Not least the one most prone to the most small-minded kind of reaction, the petit bourgeois, sometimes rendered in vulgar but accurate English as the petty bourgeoisie. Lastly, all that is solid melts into air has acquired an unintended connotation. Think of the smokestacks, and that image. Think of the smokestacks that image directly invokes. Melting into air, vast quantities of carbon, enough to tank the whole climate system. Marx had no inkling of this in the 1840s. But by the time he was working on Capital, however, he's starting to think about what he called metabolic rift. He read the earth science of his day. He understood how commodified agriculture was a maker of deserts and that this had a geochemical basis. So that's where we are, and that's why Marx Now, the peculiar form of dynamism of the commodity economy, treats both labour and nature as disposable things to be consumed in the production of exchange value and for the extraction of a surplus by a ruling class. We see clearly how this enervates and disorders the working class, how many hideous forms of physical injury, but also with mental confusion, anxiety, depression. Well, if you think your job is fucking you up, just imagine what it's doing to the biosphere. So to rephrase the old clarion call, beings of the biosphere unite. You have nothing to lose but your bonds and bond markets. We have a world to save. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Next up, Ben.
Let's see. The little bit that I'm going to extract from Marx's corpus comes from the third volume of Capital. It's on differential rent, which just means why one piece of land commands more rent than someplace else. And Marx says, from the standpoint of a higher economic form of society, private ownership of the globe by single individuals will appear quite as absurd as private ownership of one man by another. I think chattel slavery will continue to seem to us even more obscene and absurd than private ownership of land. Nevertheless, I want to talk about private ownership of land, or of the globe, as Marx significantly says, as being obscene and absurd in its own way. I think it's significant that he says the globe, not land, because of course it wouldn't be surprising to us if someone said, well, I'm a landowner. But if they said, I'm a globe owner, you'd think, what the fuck? Where'd you buy that? And yet, of course, we are in a situation like that where there are essentially private owners of the globe. And that's to say, they own these parts of the globe from which they can extract mining rents, having to do particularly with fossil fuels, that end up affecting what the rest of the real estate on the planet looks like very much. So Marx, in this little chapter, says, basically differential rent exists in two forms. There's the form that comes from ground rent, which is pure location. And I think we certainly should recall the perversity of ground rent. Ground rent, that's to say, like, it doesn't have to do with there being anything special about this bit of land, which is to say that there's a waterfall in it or an oil basin in it. And it's interesting. So Marx has various critiques of this. One of the problems with private ownership of land in this sense is simply that it doesn't encourage the productive forces to develop very quickly, because you can be absolutely passive and just sit around and collect your rent. And I find it interesting in this particularly decadent moment of capitalism that we have in the White House the scion of a owner of real estate who himself is a corrupt real estate tycoon, and whose daughter is married to another person of the same species, Kushner, that is to say. And so, I don't want to say anything good about industrial capitalism, but, at least it does develop the forces of production. Whereas, simply being a rentier does not. Did this thing just turn on suddenly? I hope people heard what I had to say earlier. It was very good. It was plagiarized. And then, the second aspect, and Marx talks about, the particular perversity that is involved with these differential rents they're often just like an exploitation of pure poverty. And as you know, probably from reading things like Planet of Slums, the highest rents in the world are not paid by people who live in palaces, but they're rack rented out of people who live and are sleeping, 8, 10, 12 to a room in slums. And so Marx says, what does he say? He says that it turns out that, this can turn basically slums into more valuable parts of land than Potosi in Bolivia, the great silver mine that, produced so much of the kind of primitive accumulation of European capital. But Marx does not neglect either mining rents, that's to say the rents that come from some specific feature of the land, its greater agricultural productivity, deposits of petroleum or copper or silver. And I think, we should think particularly about the problem with mining rents right now, which is to say that obviously they're, often now these things are formally nationalized or socialized, but of course the rents themselves go through concessions to various private corporations or state-owned companies like Saudi Aramco or whatever. So then, between the two of these things, they both tend towards enormously differential outcomes. Differential rents produce very differential outcomes in the sense that you've got some areas of the earth that, because they're owned by certain people and not by others, are absolutely laid waste to, wrecked, poisoned. People end up with very high rates of cancer or something if they've got pesticides sprayed all over them. And then other people don't have to suffer the consequences of these, or because of private ownership of land for residential purposes, can merely essentially flee to higher ground. That's to say, go and buy real estate in New Zealand or whatever. You've got an enormous sort of industry in terms of the buying of passports that's taking place right now. So these things are possible because of something that we take for granted, which is that somebody can just say, that's my part of the globe, I own it, and I don't care what it does to the rest of the globe. And in fact, the reason I don't care is because I own this other part of the globe in New Zealand, where I'm safe from all the consequences that will befall the rest of you.
Good luck with that.
And, so what Marx goes on to say in this passage, I wonder if, I guess because maybe the mic wasn't on, maybe I should quote the original line. Let's see, where is this business? So Marx says, I should have typed it out neatly like everyone else did theirs. Excuse me. It's gonna be quite good. What you may not have heard me saying, because the mic wasn't working, was that the first line that I quoted was this: from the standpoint of a higher economic form of society, private ownership of the globe by single individuals will appear quite as absurd as private ownership of one man by another. He goes on to say, even a whole society, a nation, or even all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not owners of the globe. They are only its possessors, its usufructuaries, that is to say, people who have the use of it for the fruits of the place, but they don't own it. Like boni patres familias, pardon my Latin, that is to say, good heads of households, and which reminds us that the oikos in economy and ecology has to do with household. Ultimately, the household is the earth. Like good heads of households, they must hand it down to succeeding generations in an improved condition. I think it's become very clear that it's going to be impossible to do anything like that as long as we continue to persist with this absurd convention, which we take for granted, that somebody can actually own 666 Fifth Avenue or whatever it is that the Kushners are trying to bail themselves out of, or that they can own this deposit of this sedimentary basin where a lot of oil was deposited, or that they can own this agricultural land rather than some other. We should, all of us, as Henry George proposed long ago, be getting any rent that is paid to the land that all of us are born onto just as citizens of this planet. And that's one thing to begin to demand, which means expropriating not just the owners of the means of production that have been produced by other people, but the means of production that were pre-existent, the means of production that don't result from human handiwork, but that are just lying around us in the form of the planet. So I think we think a lot about, those of us who've read Marx, we think a lot about two elements of kind of the great triad of classical political economy, which is to say labor and capital, but there's also land. Nothing can take place unless it takes place somewhere. And of course, what we're seeing right now really is the devastation of this planet for succeeding generations because of private ownership of land right now. So in addition to abolishing private ownership of the means of production in terms of actual physical plant, factories, and so forth, I think we need to do this in terms of land. And I think a reminder of the importance of doing this comes from the great communist Chilean poet Pablo Neruda in his book Canto General, which is a kind of creation myth of the Americas, which involves at moments a very sarcastic version of Genesis. In his poem United Fruit Company, it goes something like this: when the trumpet sounded, everything was prepared on earth, and Jehovah gave the world to Coca-Cola Incorporated, to Anaconda Copper, the biggest mining concern in Chile, to Ford Motor Company and other corporations. The United Fruit Company reserved for itself the most juicy piece, the central coast of my earth, the delicate waste of America. So, that can be our genesis, or we can have another genesis in which we have a different type of Jehovah that does something very, very different. So I think that Jehovah, we need to kill him off yesterday. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Chiara.
I would like to begin by performing what is elsewhere called the acknowledgement of the country. This is the fact that we're gathered here, a bunch of people coming from different backgrounds, probably different skin colors, in a city which is part of a settler colonial state. So we are standing in a land that belonged to the Lenape people who have been dispossessed, marginalized, brutalized, exterminated. We gather here, I'm Italian, speaking about a German philosopher in English, the language of empire. So that's the background of what I'm going to say. So why Marx now? Since I found it a kind of a daunting task to pick up a line and just, I knew that my philosophical mind would kick in and try to summarize the whole thing, I decided to take it transversally. to prevent this from happening. So what I will try to do is to say why, even when we try to go beyond Marx, we're still doing that together with Marx. And I will do this in particular by focusing on two areas of research, which I think have gone well beyond Marx, but still with Marx: gender and race. So here's my line. I picked up a line from the Communist Manifesto. I don't know whether that's a new school obsession, but I hope that Anwar will break the line and will pick up another text. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. A few lines down. In the place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations, end quote. So I would like to build on this line and these words and try to show how in the recent theories about so-called coloniality of power, the very building blocks of Marx's analysis of capitalism keeps recurring and recurring, even when Marx is being criticized for his own Eurocentrism. And let me just say that I use the word coloniality of power following Annibal Quijano and other studies that have followed him, because whenever we speak about colonialism, there's the attempt to think that that's something from the past. And we can forget about it. We are beyond that. Coloniality is not imbued as a concept, is not, at least not yet, buried in the past. And it's something that points to the way in which, even after the end of formal colonial domination, structure of power that were built during the time of European colonialism are constantly being produced and reproduced, to begin with the very fact that we're speaking here in a certain language with a certain composition of the panel. So, according to Quijano, who is a Peruvian Marxist thinker, unfortunately, he's written mainly essays, so is not, I think, as widely known as he should be, we cannot understand the range and depth of Eurocentrism without keeping in mind how, since the very beginning of modernity, the affirmation of a capitalist world system went hand in hand with the emergence of the concept of race, understood as a tool to classify people. There's something to remember, to think about bodies scattered around the globe in terms of races, in terms of different colors that have the function of propping up whiteness as the norm, is not an a priori of human mind. Okay? It's not always been there. We can trace its genealogy, and it's very much the genealogy of capitalism. So, this does not mean that racism and discrimination did not exist before. It means that it is only with the emergence of a global capitalist system based on an international division of labor that separated the center from the periphery that the modern concept of race, with its specific biological and hierarchical connotation, became hegemonic worldwide. Right? So all the different colors just to prop up whiteness. Quijano and others after him carefully reconstructed the way in which, during the invention of the Americas, mainly focusing here on the Americas because we are on this side of the Atlantic, talking about Marx, racial classification was first made understood in terms of the conquistadores' Christian identity, and then progressively assumed other connotation. So at the beginning, the main opposition was that between the Christians versus the Indians or the savages. But then later on, skin color, which is still very much present with us, became the phenotype to classify people. Now, again, this historical emergence. And the same way in which it appeared at some point in time, it may well disappear at another point. So what happens is that in Latin America, for instance, where wage labor was largely reserved to white, all the other races and skin color became the signifier for different sort of unwaged labor, so from serfdom, reserved mainly for the Indios, to slavery, performed by blacks in different parts of the colonies. In Anglophone America, that's where we live, Native Americans were only marginally reduced to serfdom and were rather mainly exterminated or pushed into reservation. So wage labor was largely performed by massive immigration of white settlers, probably the last one to come, and black became the signifier for slaves, and thus for those bodies whose labor could be extracted for free. I don't have the time, and I don't think there's the need here to reconstruct all the details of the argument which connect the critique of Eurocentrism with Marx's very own foundational concept of a world market. The main point to emphasize is that since the moment when European colonialism reached the entire globe, and despite all the differences in context and epochs and timings, the modern capitalist division of labor on a world scale has been and still remain intrinsically linked to the concept of race and its relative apparatus as one of the most important tools for labor control. And the reason for this is easy to understand. As a system predicated on an endless expansion of profit, that's one system, there could be others, capitalism needs both the extraction of surplus value from wage labor and the extortion of free labor and resources from unwaged relations of production. Notwithstanding all the changes, all the accelerations, all the melting in the air we have heard about, we're still living in that scenario. A world market where race and its connected disciplinary apparatuses are still largely one, if not the most powerful tool for labor control. Something similar can be said for the concept of race. Despite the fact that left feminism has gone well beyond Marx and has also criticized Marx for not being enough feminist, the Marxist toolbox is still a crucial ingredient to understand both the pervasiveness and the resilience of gender, particularly at a time when feminism has been criticized as mere white privilege, when the emancipation of some white bourgeois women can indeed happen at the expenses of further oppression of the brown bodies that replace them in the reproductive labor, it seems to me that one cannot but build from an analysis of the international division of labor and of the way in which the dividing line between productive and reproductive labor is constantly being resignified in different contexts, but also constantly being reproduced. As Marxist feminists have been pointing out for quite some time, together with race, capitalism also needs a gender division of labor because, to put it bluntly, it needs women to believe that they are fulfilling their womanly nature when they cook dinner or wash the clothes of their husband. Along with the extraction of surplus value from wage productive labor, capitalism needs the extraction of reproductive labor for free, that is, via the denial of the status of work. So the coloniality of power, which I tried to very briefly sketch above, is inseparable from what Maria Lugones called the coloniality of gender. With this move, she aims to emphasize how the binary division, men and women, and the classification of bodies according to the racial belonging actually went together and they are inseparable. This certainly does not mean that sexual difference did not exist before colonialism, before capitalism. It simply means that its dimorphic organization was not as worldwide hegemonic as it is now. I don't have the time nor the space to enter here all the details of the argument and show, for instance, how gender roles were much more flexible and variegated among the indigenous nations. Particularly in this country, the Native Americans had a very complex and variegated way to do gender, and some of them did not even do gender. certainly not in the way we are used to think about. The Yuma people attributed gender on the basis of dreams. So if you were dreaming about hunting, for all the purposes of social life, no matter what your genitalia were, you would still be a man, and vice versa. If you were dreaming about remaining in the village and taking care of children, no matter what your genitalia or what your alleged appearances were, you would still be a woman. Now, we tend to forget that this was there because we're now so used to gender dimorphism that all of this has been eclipsed, even if it's still surviving and fighting, pushing back in some way or another. So I'm saying all of this because I would like to point to the fact, as I said, transversally, that even when we are trying to go beyond Marx, and I think it's important that we keep doing that, we're still building from some of his most important concepts and building blocks. So in sum, why Marx? Always with Marx, because even in order to go beyond Marx, we still have to begin with Marx himself. Thank you.
All right. Anwar, please.
Thank you. Let me begin by apologizing for my lateness. I was stuck in traffic 3 blocks away for 20 minutes. And the only reason I didn't run is because I broke my leg. And that leg break put, this is my quote from Marx, put a check on my pretensions. Now, that quote is actually from Volume 1, Chapter 25, in the discussion of the Reserve Army of Labor. And what he talks about, which is the key thing, the theme of my little discourse here, is that when capitalism has a situation where unemployment falls, the labor market is tight, workers feel strong, wages rise, then profitability falls. This slows down growth, slows down the demand for labor, and the reserve army swells again. The gates, floodgates that hold back immigration, all that are open. We know this historically. So you get back a pool of labor, and this is where Marx says this process puts a check on the pretensions of workers, of labor. Now, the key thing here is that this highlights the fact that capitalism is a system in which actions produce reactions, and they channel and limit what can be done within the system. Profitability rules the system. That's absolutely clear. We don't have a vaccine for malaria. It's not profitable. We have millions, if not billions of dollars spent on plastic surgery because it is profitable. So we understand totally that that's how the system operates. Sorry. So I want to tie that to my particular interest. I'm an economist, and I'm proudly so. So let me say that right away. Getting to socialism is vastly harder than getting to Mars. And that's something you have to remember. And the one thing you do not want if you want to go to Mars is to have people who are fervent, know a little bit about physics, know a little bit about geology, pack the rocket with stuff, light the fuse, and let's go. Because you won't come back. In fact, you probably want to get off the ground, but you certainly will not come back. And that is because understanding how to do a difficult task requires you to understand how the basic principles translate into concrete actions. You forget to put that screw in, or you don't know that that ring doesn't handle cold very well, which happened in the Challenger thing when they blew up the whole spaceship itself, killing people. Somebody will pay the price for that ignorance. And so that brings me to the second point, which is that this explains why Marx spent so much of his life and energy writing his damn work on economics, which he called also his damn work on economics. And he thought that he had original plan was 6 books. And of that, the first book was going to be called On Capital. And he'd even finished the first book. Then you have 3 volumes of Capital. He didn't even finish that. He only finished 1 volume. And at the end, he realized his task was really beyond his time. He was ill, desperately poor, And so he said, I hope to write out the 3 volumes of Capital and leave the rest to my followers. Well, he didn't finish that, and there's a hole in the key analysis of how capitalism works, and therefore, what happens if you intervene in capitalism. It isn't enough to be militant. It isn't enough to be fervent. It isn't enough to be on the side of the working class. If you do things that harm them, they have a right to turn away from you. And this is a concrete issue. Brazil, Argentina, what happens if Corbyn wins in England? Is he just going to pump up the economy? How does that work? What's the theoretical basis for that? What's a concrete empirical basis for that? I would argue that Marx actually tried to lay that out in Capital, but it's there in bits and pieces, and quoting Capital is not going to help you with that. You have to try to trace the logic of that. You have to trace the concrete expression of that, which changes over time because capitalism is an evolving system. But you have to understand how that relates to his original arguments. I have an enormous regard for Marx. I think he is the greatest thinker in that century, possibly in modern times, but he did not finish his damn work. And our understanding of that has to take this into account. How do you take it into account? Well, you have to see how the logic holds together. Suppose, let me make this more concrete here. Suppose that you were asked by Jeremy Corbyn, look, we're about to win labor. What do we do now? One answer people give, well, support the worker. What does that mean? Raise wages? Well, what are you going to do about profits? What are you going to do about international trade? What determines exchange rates? What is the feedback effect on that on employment? What if you raise wages and workers lose jobs? What if you lower wages and workers gain jobs, as Reagan did? Then he got the support of the working class. And it wasn't just smoke and mirrors. Look at the data. You actually got a rise in employment, and people were very grateful for that, because high wages for some does not mean high wages for people who are unemployed. Now, if we don't understand how this spaceship of the capitalist economy works, if we just substitute our fervor for that understanding, then the cost of our mistakes are borne by workers. They don't hang leftists these days for making that kind of mistake. I mean, in the old days, if you're an astrologer and you said, you know, something's going to happen, you get it wrong, they pretty much punished you, and sometimes they hung you just to sort of pass the message along. Economists don't get hung for being wrong. Social scientists don't get hung for being wrong. Maybe political militants do, but that's because they were right. The difference is we really have to pay attention to the burden of Marx's work. And I don't mean that in a bad sense. It's a burden because it has to be taken seriously, it has to be taken holistically. I don't like quotes from Marx, mainly because it allows you to dismember what is in fact a whole. And I understand that quotes reflect an aspect. That's perfectly fine. But what is a representative quote for Newton or Darwin or Freud, for that matter? If you don't read their work, you will not understand the place. So I urge people to read the damn thing itself. Read Marx, and it's a mess. There's no question about it. His views change over time, and you have to understand that, and people explain how that is. He started off a believer that wages would go down to subsistence because he started from Ricardo, and then he turned against it. He started off opposed to the labor theory of value, then he turned towards it. If you don't know that, you get these quotes will be incoherent. Because any great thinker learns over time, learns from their study, and no one studied capitalism better than this man. This man, and Engels too, by the way. I want to end by saying that I went to Manchester, and I went to the Chatham Library, and I saw this room with a little table and 3 windows with leaded glass, and you could look out. And on the room, on the tables, were the books that Marx and Engels were studying when they wrote the Communist Manifesto. That is as close as I come to religion.
Wait, what books were that? Thank you. I really want to know what the books were.
Thank you all. So my task is difficult because you guys have laid so much out on the table here, and I'm not going to be able to like sew it all together. And I think that's like one of our themes as well. Is it's very difficult to do that. But there are a couple things. I also want to give every one of our. We're sort of like smushed in here in a line, like. Which is okay. It's not ideal, but like, if you have thoughts or questions or provocations or things that come to mind about what each other has said, like, do not hesitate. You can be like, Ajay, I wanna ask this question. But there were a couple things that I did hear, like, little threads running through some of these presentations. One. And what sort of is interesting to me about almost all of them is I don't think they would have been running through 40 or 50 years ago. Many of you talked about financialization. Many of you talked about climate change. I was thinking in particular, right, Chiara and Anwar, you both talked about the sort of unfinished project. Ken, I think you gestured at this as well. There's also this in this question of the cosmopolitan character, right? I forget who said it, but right, the bourgeoisie never completed its revolution, right? This idea that it was supposed to wipe the slate clean. This is also something that Ken gestured at. So I'm wondering if we might, as a group, any of you feel free to jump in, think about how we are addressing this question different today than we would have, as I said, in 1991 or in 1980. And in particular, the role of finance, land, climate, and this question of the sort of, I'll put it in scare quotes, the cosmopolitan character. And I may have scared you all off. Please.
The obvious question is, why do these rotten things happen? And the answer is because it's profitable. And we have to stop thinking of these as something that is bad for society and therefore bad. It's very good for capital. It's perfectly good to destroy the environment if you can make some profit now. That's just no way that we can get around that, and persuading them that it's bad doesn't work. The Koch brothers are not fooled because they understand that their wealth and power comes from these facts. Now, the second point I want to make is that financialization is often viewed as something to do with monopolies. I mean, people often say, these guys sitting there, and now, of course, hopefully there'll be women also sitting there, destroying the planet. And they do it because they have power and monopoly power. I want to argue that the essence of Marx's treatment of capitalism was that monopoly is not the central mechanism. It's competition, and it limits what capitalists themselves do. It's not true that a few capitalists decided to have a crisis just for the fun of it or because it wipes out weaker capitalists. Many of the big ones were also wiped out. That's also 1929. It's not new. It happens every 40, 50 years. So if we don't understand that, then we misunderstand why they themselves are trapped in this. They have to despoil the environment if it's profitable. So you have to prevent it from being profitable. You can pose limits, but how are you going to do that? The politicians are subject also to the influence of these monies. NPR has a program run by the Koch brothers, which is the Market Watch, right? They always talk. And now the numbers. There's never an unemployment number in that numbers because they're being paid by one side only. Last point, which is, again, I apologize for being an economist, but people don't often understand that financial profits in Marx, and indeed many forms of profit, merchant profit, do not come from surplus value. They come, in fact, from the old idea of buying cheap and selling dear. You buy an asset, it goes up in value. You haven't made a profit until somebody pays for it. That person is paying for your profit and the asset. Maybe it goes down, then they lose. That source, which Marx calls profit and alienation, is almost entirely lost to the Marxist discourse, which likes the idea of surplus value. But Marx is the one who introduces this idea. Look at Theories of Surplus Value, chapter 1, first 2 pages. He says there are 2 different types of profit, and he's quoting someone else and all that. So when I say that his work is unfinished, he should have put that in volume 3, right? It was pretty obvious. But he didn't write volume 3. Engels put it together. And you can't blame Engels for doing what he did, but you have to take seriously the logic of it. Financial profits do not come from surplus value by and large, except for those rents, interest, and dividend payments that come directly. Derivatives don't. And if we understand that, we can link it back, because this pyramid of finance rests on surplus value, but it's not reducible to it. That's an important point.
I think Chiara and then Drucilla.
Yes, I just wanted to respond to Anwar and begin by saying that I'm very glad he's an economist, and I think it's unbelievably important what he said in terms of really understanding the way in which capitalism works now, and doing this very fine work of completing the work that Marx initiated, finishing the project. On the other hand, I'm also wondering what is the space for thinking about radical alternative to capitalism, and whether just remaining within a study of the economics can illuminate us as to radical alternative to it, like the possibly thinking of alternative economic system. I'm saying this because although I have for quite some time flirted with the idea of the total reification of life, I'm coming to think more and more that the capitalist logic is never as pervasive as we may want to think it is. So not just in terms of world different geographies and areas, but also in terms of our lives. There are moments, there are places where even where systems, there are systems at place, they don't work according to the logic of capital. So I wonder whether there's not some sort of inspiration to be taken there, and whether the very fact that as much as Marx own writings and thinking about capitalism, the very project of capitalism, the very project of reducing every living relations to the logic of capital is unfinished in itself. And I wonder whether those sites of resistance should not be mobilized for thinking about something we haven't yet said, revolution.
Drucilla, then Kali.
I want to maybe make 3 points. And the first is interesting because I don't think we remember sometimes the brutal history of the United States in destroying the great socialist experiments throughout the world. Mm-hmm. There are 2 September 11ths in my life. The first is much more important. The day that Salvador Allende locked himself in his office, a man democratically elected, who swore that democratic socialism based on an ethical view of a new humanity was possible. And in that brief year that he ruled, he engaged in so many experiments, including different ways of expropriating the expropriators. And we don't remember them. We don't think about them. This is, I think, both of your points, because they didn't die with him. His last words, as he had to have a joking conversation with Fidel Castro, who gave him an AK-47, "I will never use this gun." He said, "It looks like I'm going to use it. So you have to teach me how." Were the following: "I died today because I will not surrender the dreams that we have realized materially in a democratically socialist Chile. I die today, but the dream of a democratic socialism does not die with me. I die today so that dream does not die." We need to remember Allende's words. And many of us think September 11th is when some people from Saudi Arabia drove their airplanes into the World Trade Center. That's not my September 11th. My September 11th is when Allende stood by that dream. Now, he did so many interesting experiments of collective ownership, of different forms of expropriation, of new ways of thinking about how to expropriate, of different ways of deploying technology. And we haven't built on them. Then we have Nicaragua, we have the Sandistas. Of course, you know Henry Kissinger said when Allende was elected, we are looking at the face of a dead man. So the United States' intentions towards Allende were clear from the beginning. And that's all history. Now, you know, as a citizen of the United States, something I'm constantly trying to escape, I feel the weight. I feel the burden. I feel the blood on my hands. Because we're citizens of this country. Our country went into another country and overthrew that government. Not when we did it in Nicaragua, and we did it in Iran, and we would have done it in South Africa. Now, why didn't we do it in South Africa? Because we found the English and the United States, Nelson Mandela. And he, after 27 years in jail, had completely capitulated to neoliberal capitalist organization of the economy. There was something called the Reconstruction and Development Program, but it was a fraud. And my friend, comrade, who recently died, Sampi Turnbull, developed a whole, based on Allende, social democratic program, at least social democratic program, thinking he was actually working with a program that might be initiated. It never was. And what did Mandela do? He systematically demobilized all of the mass movements that had overthrown apartheid. And that's why, and I want us to all take a moment and remember her, Winnie Mandela divorced him. No, not because she was having an affair with a lawyer. No, because she could not love a man who was selling out everything she had stood for through torture, imprisonment, her children being taken away from her. No, she stood for the voiceless throughout this struggle and the mobilization of the people, and she would not allow for the demobilization, and she stood with Chris Hani. We will mobilize a socialist economy. That's why Winnie divorced Nelson Mandela. Not because she was a bad wife, and not because she was a slut, if you're forgiving my French. We need to remember, and this is everything you've said, and we need economists to do it, to think through what these great experiments are. Because they're there, and they have been there for a long time, but they never get the recognition because of the naturalization that capitalism is the only system in town. And I just want to end with the third point. We talk about technology. I run a project in South Africa, and I had an appointment at the University of Venda, very poor, formerly black, maybe there's 3 white administrators at this university. So it's formally, it's kind of in quotation marks. It's dead poor. The government gives money to the white universities at 10 times the level of the black universities. So I've recently taken my appointment to Venda. Now, the reason this is important is that what you see in a country like South Africa is the complete collapse of transformation. So that does leave you, Chiara, but revolution has to be on the table again, because there isn't any way that neoliberal capitalism will ever be able to decolonize South Africa. But the other fantasy we have is that everybody has an iPhone. An iPhone is a luxury in South Africa. And South Africa is one of the most advanced countries in Africa. The idea that everybody is lit up, everybody's on the internet, everybody is on Facebook, that is simply not the case in the global south. It is a great privilege to be able to have access to that kind of technology. And so when we speak of technology, we have to remember the huge differential between the United States, where we can be constantly diverted from revolutionary struggle by being on Facebook, and other countries that have zero access. When the students went on strike and shut down the universities 2 years in a row, the only way they have the internet is to be in the library. And so the administrators shut them out of the library because they knew that the black students would have no access then to any of the work and technology they needed to do their exams. So I think we always have to remember that the technological fantasy is part of a global network that systematically disadvantages both sides.
Okay.
Yeah, now I have several different minds now. I'm glad you touched on that technology piece because I think people often don't recognize how inaccessible that is to people right here, to certain communities right here within the United States. Definitely within the community I work with in Jackson, a significant portion of the community does not have iPhones, does not have any of this, and there's very little access to it. And there's another form of what also we've touched upon, but there's another form of exclusion. And it's not just social exclusion, it's actually exclusion from being able to participate and engage in the market and increasingly being able to participate and engage in official society. And that's a critical part of what is taking place right here within our own confines, right? So that's a critical piece so for me, I think what we're trying to articulate in regards when you all are talking about alternatives is in some respects, we're trying to do some innovative work, some dreaming work, some alternative building work in what we call community production. But we see it as a major gamble and a major risk. And it makes us oddballs in many respects within this kind of emerging cooperative world. Because it's not a model that we can necessarily point to with great ease. Us engaging in this experiment is going to be profitable in any form or fashion. But the question winds up being outside of profitability, at least in our direct community, can we afford to be excluded from the development of this technological pace and orientation, which is a different orientation than saying we have to make sure that this business enterprise is profitable. Can you afford to be excluded? If you have some elements and the ability to exercise a democratic choice to engage in doing or engaging in developing these kind of productive forces. So even my point to try to make the connection is that even when we dream, and I'm one that thinks that is trying to encourage folks to always look towards revolution, to never take that off the agenda, to dream and to dream the big. Anybody who knows me, and I try to dream far beyond what I know I can do. But I think it's a goalpost and a goal mark and something that keeps folks energized on making and owning their own agency as opposed to being confined to the limits that they are normally constricted within. But then we have to recognize there is a serious gap around actually knowing what the hell that we're doing. And that is a critical piece that I know, at least within Cooperation Jackson, we're confronting. And one of the things that, there's 3 of us now who, it sounds crazy, but I think the only thing that we can name it is we're trying to figure out how do you make an anti-capitalist business model? Right? How do you do that? And how do you do that with the premise that you're going to do business not only in a way that not just distributes the surplus or distributes the profit, but you're going to do it in a way which is as economically sound as possible, ecologically sound as possible, which automatically threatens in our system, automatically threatens your bottom line. So there's still some technical pieces to how this thing actually functions and works that I don't think we fully have a grasp of within the left, and I think a lot of our practical projects suffer for a lack of it. I know I'm seeing and facing that in a major way in terms of what we're trying to develop, because there's kind of a growing divide between, in our work in Cooperation Jackson, between being practical, which means just stick to your normal kind of business model, cooperative model, as opposed to putting what we would call, say, what I was trained in those, putting in the old school way, putting politics in command. When those directly confront with your bottom line. And having the knowledge and skill or the expertise of folks who most of our members have not gone to college, have some major literacy challenges, and I'm asking them to develop an anti-capitalist business model. Now, I don't take that as something that's an impossible task in the least, but it's hard to articulate trying to go someplace when, at least I'm gonna speak for myself, I don't feel comfortable about knowing all the different mechanics of the economy itself. And I've read pretty much all the things, and I think I have a fairly decent grasp of Marx and a fairly decent grasp of the economy, but there's some major pieces around, you know, particularly how finance work in the here and now, that I don't think we really have a clear grasp of on the left right now. And without having a clear grasp of it, leads us to making, I think it just leads us, I think, oftentimes to calling tactics strategy, when we fundamentally don't have a strategy. And I think we need to come to grips with that and do the work, I think, to really take that on. And let me speak to one point, then I'll stop, trying to link this together. So, you know, I thought one of the ways in which capital was going to try to resolve the crisis after the financial collapse 06, 07, 08, was that there was going to be a major investment in automation. And instead, they kind of sit on most of that money. And the things that have been, to me, at least in my analysis of it, the thing that they've done the most is not so much invested in automation. They've done more of an investment in AI. And that is a piece I think that we need to examine, which is about this, is there a shift in a transition in the overall process of accumulation, which is more about social control than it is necessarily about profit at this particular point in time. Because what they've mastered is all this technology to surveil and track us and to monitor us and to come up with algorithms to monitor and predict our behavior. Like, that has been where the greatest investment is. And it's a way that it's done to such a degree that we all willingly participate in it. And I'm left with, what was it, Mark Zuckerberg's comments, I don't remember the exact quote, when he was asked about spying, right? Is Facebook spying? He said, no. Because people willingly give us that information. So it's profoundly different, at least in his mind, and I think he represents the sector of capital view. It's profoundly different in the level of social control that we're actually exerting because people willingly participate in the surrendering of this information and being shaped by how this piece is being rolled out, which I think speaks to a bigger piece around in your point around where do we see social activity and social transformation happening? And how do we see it happening, I think is a big question, because there is a critical piece of being more connected to social media but less connected to other humans that I think we definitely have to figure out if we're going to make a real go at transformation.
One of the things Marx changed his mind about actually is technology, but that he was trying to have a critical theory of technology was actually kind of ahead of his time. In fact, ahead of the time of the editors of his collected works who excluded the notebooks and manuscripts on technology from them, so they're not even part of the corpus. So, you know, beyond the 6 books that Marx was trying to write, there's other ones that he didn't think to write that we still have to write after him, right? And one of those, it seems to me, is about the forces of production, which aren't the forces of production of Marx's time. This is not a steam-based era. The information science begins here in New York in 1948, to give it an arbitrary date, at Bell Labs with the mathematical theory of communication, which was written by Shannon, and the invention of the transistor, for which Nobel Prize was awarded, right? Like there's a transformation in the forces of production of a qualitatively different kind. I think Engels was aware that one needed to have a handle on these things. We spend so much time trying to figure out the sciences. At exactly the same time that the chemical industry in Germany is getting going. There's a kind of industrial appropriation, a commodification of new forms of knowledge beyond which Marx had been able to conceive. So I think there's a kind of unfinished task there. Like, what would a critical theory of information science look like? And I have to say, it doesn't matter if you have a cell phone in your hand. It's the infrastructure that that cell phone's connected to is the thing to pay attention to. And that is global, and it affects the life chances of everybody. And it affects your life chances even more if you don't have any access to it or connection to it, right? Someone else is going to decide that the value of your labor is worth nothing, or that this production will go someplace else. Like, you don't even have a knowledge of what is going to be done to you. So that it has a hinterland doesn't negate the fact that, you know, there's a kind of global infrastructure of a kind that's kind of like barely thinkable in the age of the telegraph. That's now what commodification runs on. So, you know, there are other unwritten books. The other one is to do with the natural sciences and versions of earth science. Marx just barely glimpsed that the window to figure any of this out is kind of closing because, you know, we're kind of treating it as if one can produce an economy in an open system when it's actually closed, and we're starting to realize it's closed. It's one planet, like there ain't a second one, you know? Like, forget about terraforming Mars. We never figured out how to terraform Earth, right? Like, we don't know. Like, you know, commodification doesn't do it. What we're doing is Venus forming Earth, right? Turning it into a runaway greenhouse effect. That's what we're doing. And we know that because there's a science of it. What would be a critical relation to that science? What would be a critical relation to information science? And you could go through. So I think that, you know, the project is even vaster than the unwritten 6 books. But it means that all kinds of intellectual labour have to work together in a comradely fashion. I just don't think there's a master discourse. There's no one discipline. We'll have to figure out what an equality of forms of knowledge would be.
I want to come back to a theme because it may have been misunderstood. My opening remarks were my belief that socialism is much harder to get to than Mars or Venus or whatever. But then, why would we want to know what the Earth is like if we're planning to go to Mars? Right. And the answer is that we don't know what's on Mars. And if we don't understand what's on Earth, we'll be utterly unprepared, even more unprepared than our ignorance would allow. We need to know as much as we can in order to go to someplace unknown. The second point is that my understanding of Marx was that it's not about economics, it's about political economy. And political economy encompasses socialism also. And by the way, Marx has lots of critiques of socialist schemes in his various writings because he argues that they're not economically feasible. On the other hand, there are economically feasible societies within our purview who we don't hold as models, or perhaps not all of us hold as models, because they don't fit our idea of socialism, but they're economically very viable. The Amish. The Amish are male-dominated, Christian, politically and religiously structured society, but they help each other. They're very cooperative. If someone gets hurt or their barn burns down, everybody stops and they build it back up. But they do something even more astonishing to me, which is that they require every young person to leave at the age of 18. They kick them out. They say, go live among the English, which is us, everybody else. Do what you need to do, and then you tell us within a year whether you want to come back to our restricted, structured society or you want to be free. Almost all of them come back. Now, have we been able to form a socialism that says to people, okay, until the age of 18 you're with us, then go out and then come back. We haven't. We mostly had people who want to leave, and we've had to lock them in. And if we don't understand that, we don't understand why we failed, then going to Mars is not going to help us.
Okay, go for it. And then I think we'll go to the audience.
Yeah, I'm completely with you that in the Global South we are tied in to the technological network, but they're tied in as disenfranchised partners.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that. Because if you have a little cell phone with a SIM card and no contract and no access to internet or anything else, and the internet, there's no internet in your township, and as you know, most townships were not even lit up during apartheid, and now they're only partially lit up now. So we're talking about lights. We're not talking about internet access. So I think that what happens often is the incredible differential between the Global South and South Africa is one of the most advanced African countries, quote unquote. We need to remember what that is. And then the second point, and I think we're all in agreement with this, is that the great socialist experiments like that Allende began, or Sampi Terenblanche, a South African economist who presented an entire program of transformation when Reconstruction and Development seemed real. But these programs need to be studied and looked at because there are other ways of organizing the economy that are available to us. And yet, they're not only not taught, they are pretty much suppressed. I asked my students once in one of my seminars, what are the two 9/11s? They didn't have any knowledge that one was the murder of Allende. So the way the universities are being privatized, the way education is being passed down, the way in which knowledge of those great experiments, including in Africa, Nyera, Senghor, Césaire, who was mayor of Port-de-France, is a communist. These experiments were going on all over the world. And is that history even accessible to us? Is it being taught? What is socialism? How do people experiment with it? And the answer is no. So I think that part of our task is, of course, to remember that we are in an obvious global economy, but we've been in a global economy since Nyera was defeated and Senghor was defeated because of the IMF and the structures of the IMF for a long time. So I think that if I had to lead the audience with any encouraging words, it is that mobilization of mass struggles matters. It changes things. And I think that the most important thing we can do is both to engage with all the difficult economic questions of transformation, yes, but also then to begin to mobilize behind them so that we begin to see that there are absolute alternatives to anything called neoliberal capitalism.
Thank you. Before, I think we want to open it up to the audience a bit. Could I get Mark or Valentina? Could someone come, or do you want to do it? Yeah.
Thank you so much for the panel discussion. So I'm very much interested in the question of Marx now, but also Marx when. And so, right, I think that it's a lot of work is required to accomplish Marxism. I'm worried that sometimes theorizing about Marxism can be almost passive-aggressive and procrastinatory. And so I'm interested in how, well, who holds the responsibility for accomplishing Marxism? But then linked to that question is who even, what's involved in the means to protest effectively? How do we create spaces of accountability where we can actually begin to change the order of things.
Let's collect a few and then I'll throw them around.
In this ideal Marxist society, what is the place of women? Are they, I mean, because today they're second-class citizens, and I even see them as enslaved, really. If it's the same, what difference does it make?
Thank you, everyone, for a really interesting and stimulating discussion. There's been the Communist Manifesto quoted a couple of times, so I'm just going to add another quote there on top of it, of the state being the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, for the management of the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. And I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts as to what the question of political power means for the transition to socialism today. We know Lenin had one conception of it. We know Allende had another one. Do any of you have thoughts about that today?
Thank you for your discussion. You probably hear where I'm from. So I was born in the Soviet Union and live here for more than 20 years. And I really agree with your point about learning about these experiments, because nobody really understands what really was happening in the Soviet Union. And from my point of view, only a successful experiment, but it's only my point of view, I'm not philosopher, economist, it was in Israel, kibbutz, when they lived communally, it was communal living, a communal work. But what I heard, that when they become successful, they very often sell there as a business, divide money, send their kids to schools in Europe, and then live happily after. And nobody cares about living again communally and work together. How you respond to this?
So we have Marx when, Women in Marxism, the state, and the Soviet Union / the kibbutz. We'll just go right down the line.
I want to begin with the women question, because I think it's hugely important. I decided to speak about that among all the possible things I could mention, the question of the coloniality of gender, and tied it with that of race, because there's a tendency to think that we're going to think about capitalism and then at some point add gender and women and mix it, and then things are going to be fine. I mean, you can't do that. I mean, people tried for a few centuries, and it just meant that instead of thinking about liberation, people thought about liberation for men, which wasn't exactly great for women. So I think that has to be inside of the thinking and the action from the very beginning. So even the question, what is the role of women? It's very bad that you're raising the question. It should have been in the thinking from the very beginning. It's not that feminism is a women question. The gender division of labor is across all bodies. We are all gendered. Whether clearly some people benefit more from the gender division of labor than others, but we are all complicit. So there's no way to say, let's think about why Marx now, and then maybe have a final chapter of the day on the question of women. So that's why I wanted to speak first. Okay, so the question of the role of power, what conception of power, the Soviet Union versus the kibbutz, which experiment. So I personally agree with Castoriadis' diagnosis of the Soviet Union as an example of state capitalism. So that's not exactly the example of socialism that I think Drucilla was thinking about when she was saying that, we don't even have knowledge. I don't know enough about the kibbutz, but I know, I totally agree with what Drucilla said. There are so many experiments of alternative organization of economics. There have been so many experiments and attempts to enact socialist societies that we don't have the knowledge. I mean, we are here talking in English. That's the language of empire. What we learn, what is translated in those languages, unless we are lucky enough and we have done all the dirty job of learning other languages. So that's huge. This is by itself. It's a daunting task, but it's something that, at least we should keep in mind when we do this. I think, at least this is the way I've heard Drucilla's point. So, in terms of the question of power and which strategy and Marx when, I tend to stay on the libertarian side and think that the oppression is multiple, so we have to act on multiple grounds. So every when and everywhere is good. There's no just one privileged side for the struggle of power. So I don't think that there is just one road to be pursued. There's not one unique recipe, and I would actually be very worried if there were.
Only thing I'll touch on and try to add on, speaking for myself, I'm not trying to live I'm not trying to live in a Marxist society. I'm trying to live in a liberated society. Marx contributed towards and made some contribution towards helping us to liberate our thoughts and our thinking. But I'm not trying to limit, I'm not trying to limit from just that train of thought when there's so much more that he didn't know, couldn't have known, that we have to figure out collectively. So did he point us in some right directions? I think yes. That doesn't mean that he was so profoundly prescriptive that there was no room for improvement. And I think we have the benefit, as I see it, we have the benefit of the experiments of the 20th century. However, bad they may have been, or short-lived, or just cut off at the neck, from imperialism, we do have the benefit of those experiences. The question is, are we going to seriously study them, interrogate them, and then allow them, with our own experimentation, be a guide towards our practice and our action? To me, I think that speaks to this question around, you talked about the state, right? Or was that one of the questions? One of the questions. We're in a little experiment with that right now in my hometown, and we're having a rough go at it, which is not a negative thing, in my view. Not a negative thing. I think the question is, what can folks learn from what we're struggling? What can we learn from what we're doing? And then figuring out what is translatable in your context and what is not. I will say this, I think at least the formulation that I have found most dear in that respect, I wouldn't say comes from the Venezuelans, but I think there's a sector of their movement which is articulated, I think, in a way I find most useful and practical, which is that we're struggling for a participatory and protagonistic democracy, right? And a participatory and protagonistic government, a government that takes sides and does not try to uphold bourgeois liberalism and this whole neutrality. Like, no, that's not what we're doing. That's not what we should be doing, in my view. But we have to recognize that there are real consequences for taking that. And are we prepared to deal with that? And I think, this may be a controversial piece. I haven't seen but a few examples in society where the forces from the left come into quote unquote state government and actually do a serious enough job of preparing people for the consequences that come from challenging the system. And I think that is something that we need to figure out how to do and do better, critically better. And then the other piece that I'm always reminded of is, which is where, in my mind, I've always tried to see our movement going. And there's another phrase, you know, again, not from Venezuela, but where I first heard it in the 1980s, comes from some of the movement there, which is that, you know, we don't want to be the government, we want to govern. Right? And that's a critical distinction, and I think sometimes we lose sight of in the quest for state power as being the thing that's going to solve all of our problems relative to the struggle in the task at hand.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, did you want?
Yeah, go for it. This is being passed so ceremoniously. It's very exciting now to have this. Is it working this day yet? Well, you know, I'm somewhat loath to wade into the question of revolutionary strategy, which one of those questions involved, but I do have a very sort of minor sort of plea as concerns the culture of the left. I think one of the things that I really enjoy in Marx, but find like least helpful, is his tremendous powers of rhetorical indignation, of not suffering fools gladly. You're just an idiot if you don't agree with him on every point, even as he changes his mind over the decades. And I find this in my own experience of the culture of the left. That's to say, you know, people are like, well, you know, that's absurd, you trot. That's absurd, you reformist. And you think, of course, it's actually relatively easy to see what's wrong with all of these different points of view. But clearly, nobody seems to be in possession of the key to, the skeleton key to sort of revolutionary strategy. Otherwise, we would have put it in the lock and turned it, and we would know what we're doing. And I have found it off-putting to have people who've like arrived at rather abstruse theoretical positions through, you know, studies of various, you know, secular international thinkers, and they think if you don't accept this application of completely bygone analyses of historical circumstances to our particular moment, you know, you're obviously kind of some sort of, you know, renegade idiot. And you know, it's not as if what we should just do is sit around and have a friendly discussion with one another that means not ever to have any revolutionary fruits. But at the same time, it's clear that, like, you know, it's not 1989. More and more people are going to come to talks like this because people see that capitalism is fundamentally not working and that we have to replace it somehow. And it seems to me that what we don't want to do is to, you know, deflect that energy by, you know, the kind of familiar devils of sectarianism. Not that we shouldn't be heated, because this is a matter of, you know, it's a subject of passionate importance. But so basically, I don't know what to do about revolutionary strategy, but I feel like I'll have a better, I'll figure it out better if, you know, people are nicer and in discussing it.
I have to second that ecumenical call, because none of the strategies of the late movement proved to be completely successful. So, like, why pick? I mean, there's probably things in all of them and things we haven't thought of. I want to pick up that question of the state with the, if you'll pardon a sort of ironic thought, that like the state that seems best able to be the ruling class in committee these days is the People's Republic of China. And that is a great historical irony that needs at least to be noted. And just a speculative thought that maybe the American state is actually not the ruling class in committee, and that's part of its dysfunction. It's something even worse than that. It turns out that is imaginable, and is where we are. I will confess my slogan for the Obama campaign, I thought, should have been put the ruling class back in charge, as like a minimal demand, you know, because it ended up being a hell of a lot worse, you know, is where we've ended up. So there could be things worse than that state. The other thing to bear in mind about the state is that the reformist wing of the labour movement fought the ruling class to a draw on certain issues, and part of the state I always thought were ours, and were in tension with other parts. So-called neoliberalism is the attack on those components of the state, to drive the past victories of the labour movement back out of the state. So it might need more language to describe that. Neoliberal doesn't describe all of that. I noticed Labour's never mentioned in the rhetoric of neoliberalism. So to bear in mind, state's always a complicated question, and here I'm just glancing on it with a couple of provocations.
I would just add, with Obama, put the ruling class back in power who has the fantasy that they're ruling on behalf of all the people. Because Donald Trump has no fantasy that he's ruling on behalf of anybody but his immediate real estate interests. And so we actually do have something different, because whatever you think of Obama, he actually believed that he, old-fashioned bourgeois ideology, that he was ruling on behalf of the people. Of course, he wasn't, but, that he had that investment, and that investment made him very appealing. Nelson Mandela had that investment too, and his former wife said, no, 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 oh no. And Chris Hani, who was assassinated, said no. The thing I want to add, though, is there are mass movements going on all over the place right now. And there's no reason not to join them, because there's no such thing as a perfect movement. I was in Marxist-Leninist groups as a kid. I was a union organizer. What Marxist-Leninist groups called colonizers, a horrible word, meaning you were sent in to work in a factory. And yes, there were very strong union movements in New York. The restaurant workers was one of the strongest unions. The garment workers. The taxi union. In the last month, 17 taxi drivers have committed suicide, because being a taxi driver is in New York no longer a feasible occupation. Now, everybody can do something very simple. Wipe Uber off your apps, never get into an Uber car, and maybe do something a little militant, like throw, not at the drivers, but throw rocks at the cars. Do something. Bring Uber to its knees on behalf of the taxi workers. And you see, what happens to us with all these apps is we get seduced into it. Taxi Workers Union was one of the strongest in the city. So yes, the destruction of the union movement in the United States, systematically done, starting with Ronald Reagan, has demobilized one of the most important movements that has always fought, including, despite all of its racism, for civil rights. That's why Martin Luther King got shot. He started to talk about class, race, gender, and unity, a people against the ruling class, and that was for him. So I think that when we get very pessimistic, as Rosa Luxemburg said, pessimism is only for those who have enough to eat. And we need to see that these movements, those adjuncts at every major Ivy League school, are unionizing right now. And go join the picket lines. They need help. So I think that one of the things that happens is that the investment that there are no mass movements is itself a self-fulfilling prophecy. There are mass movements in every block in New York City that you can be part of. And the most important thing is don't wait for a pure mass movement. There's always going to be, you're going to disagree with this, you're going to disagree with that, you're going to disagree with the other. Get in the struggle. Get your hands dirty and start fighting back.
I want to remind people that Lenin was a real revolutionary, actually did a huge thing, but he spent a lot of time studying theory. Anybody knows anything about Lenin's history and his practice is that he was also a great theoretician. And he did connect his understanding of theory to his politics. So the idea that these are separable makes no sense to me. This is what I meant by going to Mars. Not everybody's going to be a physicist or an engineer, but if you don't work collectively, for sure you will not get off the ground. So it's important to know the past in order to prepare for the future. Now, one of the things that capitalism does, perhaps all societies do, is teach us to forget. to make us forget. You know, when the men in black have this thing, they have a little device, and when they don't want you to remember, they just press a button, it's a neuralizer, ping, a light comes on, and you forget everything. Well, capitalism does that, exactly. It does it through the bling and the flash that directs our attention towards those things, but also removes from history the knowledge that would otherwise disrupt the system. And part of our function is to keep that knowledge up in front, keep reminding people, even though they may walk out of here, hell, flash, and then they don't remember anything. That's maybe I'm just complaining about my students, but anyway. The other thing is that Marx was not a prophet. He's not a religious figure. He did the best he could with the knowledge he had. He was a genius, but that doesn't mean that you have to take his words as religious gospel. You have to understand the logic of it, and perhaps you don't agree with the logic, but you have to at least encounter that logic, just as you would with Newton or Einstein. Maybe you think you're beyond Newton and Einstein, and perhaps you are, but first you need to know them in order to know whether you are. And that doesn't mean that everybody has to know everything. If we're going to do this, we have to be collective, which means that people have different areas of knowledge, and the only way we get ahead is that we share and discuss that knowledge and disagree. I mean, a normal part of any process like that. I wanted to mention talk a little bit about the kibbutz, Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. Don't forget Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was market socialism. I was there. I traveled across it, and it was very clear to me that what was happening is that the market creates inequality. And so the state had to stamp the inequality out by repressing it, and then everybody was unhappy because the enterprises that were not doing well were not doing any better, and the enterprises that were doing well were angry. And so the problem with market socialism was the market part. It creates self-interest, conflict, antagonism. And so the idea for me that you can base a socialism on markets misses the point of markets, which is to try to get better than someone else. And inequality is a characteristic feature. This, by the way, one of the comments Marx makes about views of market socialism. Kibbutz is the same thing. Capitalism and markets are very corrosive. If you insert a kibbutz, remember communes? I'm old enough to remember communes. They didn't last either for the same reason. It was very hard to maintain them in the corrosive influence of capitalism and the influence of what is striking to me about the Amish is that they do that. Right. And because they have a strong binding force, and that's for me very important to understand, strong binding force.
They also rig the system. They don't let the kids get an education.
Well, yes, but it's a binding force. That's a fact. You know, we have lots of people in capitalism who don't let their kids get education, but they say capitalists. They don't go socialist.
Or they can't get allowed. They can't get access to education.
Maybe, but I think you shouldn't overemphasize how good education is, because education is part of the neuralizer part. Don't forget that. That's part of what education does. But my point is that we need to understand forms that we don't like in order to understand what we can take from that. And there are experiments being done all over, as Chiara said, all across the world and through time. Many have failed, but we can learn something from their successes and their elements, and perhaps we can figure out how to have a binding force for society that is strong enough to allow people to leave it and want to come back. Now, there's a question whether that will happen in a poor economy or rich, but we already know that that's not the central question. What binds people together is not the wealth that they have, but the connections and the social matrix, the place they feel they have. So that raises the question, in the ideal society, what is the place of women? I don't think we can answer that question, either men or women, until we talk about what this ideal society looks like. It's not a question of just placing men and women there. We have to talk about where that place is. And to do that, we have a lot more issues than male-female. We also have a third world, and I mean, imagine that we would say capitalism is a great country. I mean, U.S. is a great country. We'll make it even greater by just dropping the borders and letting everybody move here. But let's say we only did it for women. Do you think that the system can absorb that? I don't think so. I think that's exactly why this system is limited. And so if you're going to talk about some other system, You have to have some story, some idea of how it would work in order to talk about these issues more concretely.
Just trying to get you to speak closer to the mic. I'm actually going to say something super quickly. And thinking especially about this, the kibbutzim question and the sort of state and women in Marxism, there's a sort of question of like original sin and like limitation of imagination. And the exclusion of women is from the imagination of early socialist thinkers. It's not all of them, but many, from many early Marxist thinking, is such a gross misunderstanding of the thing they were meant to be studying, which is the division of labor. So like this to me is intimately related with the failure of the kibbutzim, right? The kibbutzim are founded on two principles, right? One, they were independent labor, meaning only Jewish, no Arab, right? I think there was maybe 1 or 2 integrated kibbutzim. 2, actually it's 3 things. 2, as Anwar said, in the corrosive larger system of capitalism, which it was not part of trying to overturn. 3, part of an overall project to create a nation like any other, right? That was the goal. It was not the overturning of global capital. It was to be like all the other capitalist states. Which brings me to the last thing, which I'm so glad that Ken raised the sort of the issue of the Communist Party of China. Whenever you hear someone on the sort of radio or the TV say, "Oh, capitalism, it's so great," right? It's in the past 50 years, X number of people have been lifted out of poverty by unfettered free trade and the expansion of capitalist markets, this, that, and the other. What they're translate that into English. Is the Communist Party of China has lifted X number of people out of poverty. Now, I'm not like a super thrilled with the way they've done it, but they are that. If you take them out of the equation, that is things have been going badly for a long time. And when we think about the Soviet Union, there's more than one experiment in the Soviet Union, right? Like I am not one of those people who thinks it's like the second Lenin like put his pen on like State and Revolution, like the whole world. Like it was like foregone conclusion. But like the Leninist project is not the Stalinist project. It's not the Bukharin project of the NEP. It's not the Khrushchev project of like It's not the certainly not the Rosa Luxemburg project. But the point is that even amongst the Soviet Union, the best known example, right, of actually existing socialism, there are so many different elements that we don't study, we don't learn, and we don't understand. And that's sort of the last thing is the state, right? The state changes. I think again, Ken, I'm really glad you sort of raised this, right? Like the specter of the right destroying the state has always been a little bit bullshit, right? They destroy the part of the state that expresses democratic sovereignty. They expand the part of the state that is surveillance, policing, and militarization, the enforcement of private property. This is a dynamic that leftists have to take more seriously.
I just wanted to respond to 2 things. One on the question of the state. The state changes, but let's say, first of all, historically speaking, it has not always been there. It's also a relatively recent advent. And there's no state without a monopoly of coercion predicated upon a clearly circumscribed piece of land. So it's the organized control of a population living inside a certain piece of land. Now, it may change its faces, but its connection with the land and the sovereign, the exercise of sovereign power over a certain population and the control of the land has always been there since the beginning of the state. That's why, it's not that the world was better before. I'm not saying this, but there's a way in which the state and colonialism went together from the very beginning. People tend to think, well, the state began in Europe, then it was exported to the rest of the world. No, the state began in Europe because at the same time when the control of the land was being exercised in Europe through the emergence of the form of the state, raw resources were dragged from the colonies. So state and colonialism have always gone together. I still haven't figured out whether the state is a tool of colonialism or whether colonialism is a tool of the state, but you can't abolish one without abolishing the other. So that's my 2 cents on the state. I think the two go together. If the expression, the racial state, it's a pleonasm. State is always a racist in as far as it implies that a certain body of population has more rights than another one. So there's no, I don't think there's a, maybe it's a big statement, I know, but I do think that's the question of, at least for me, that's where I'm going in thinking about the question of the state. Secondly, Anwar, I loved your talk, but I still have to disagree on the question of women. We have to think about where we're going, and then we add women. Again, it's not going to work. It's going to, if... Well, okay, so maybe I interpreted badly, but so let me just restate what I thought. I mean, the thinking about the gender division of labor has to be there from the very beginning. And I do think that it's a big problem even to insert this only late in not just the thinking, but also the political action. Like it's we are all gendered in various ways, and we can't. There's a way in which we can't just disentangle the two things. Even when we say women, we are talking about job description. So it's, there's no way we cannot insert women in the thing from the very beginning. Sorry, I mean, that was provocative, but I thought it was...
Drucilla wants to jump in. I'm not sure if anyone else does.
I want to say two things about the state. First, the greatest female Marxist theoretician, Rosa Luxemburg, wrote a polemic called The Russian Revolution, where she said that almost everything the Bolsheviks had implemented through the empowerment of the state against radical forms of participatory democracy were anti-socialist. The Soviet Union was never socialist. Rosa Luxemburg won the day. Yes, she died, and yes, she was a woman, and therefore has never been given the acclaim that Vladimir Lenin did. And Trotsky certainly didn't deserve any recognition as a democratic socialist. Boy, was that a fantasy. So she took on the disarmament of the Constitution. Yeah, I mean, one large fantasy with that guy. She took on the disarmament of the Constituent Assembly. She took on their land policy. She took on their phony national self-determination policy. She took on their absolute failure to address the gender and family question. And she died in 1918. Everyone should go look at the Russian Revolution. It had faltered, as she said, maybe some of this was necessary, but socialism lies in the midst of the future. This is what we're all saying. We don't know what socialism is. None of us have any idea. But if we do know, it's going to be because all of us get together and try to think about how we might live together differently, and nothing will remain the same. Everything melts into air, at your point. So there's no socialism in Eastern Europe. There was no socialism in the Soviet Union. There's no socialism in China. There's never been any socialism. But there were some great experiments in the global south, and no one pays any attention to them. So you have great thinkers like Enrique Dussel, the difference between liberatory nationalism and conservative nationalism in the way you view the state. And all this comes from Frantz Fanon. You have Cesare, you have Senghor, you have Nayara, you have all of these leaders in the global south. Are we reading them? No, because they're black. So, I mean, they tried, each one of them, to institutionalize a completely different relationship to the state. Nayara tried to disband the state, basically. And no, it didn't work. But then, do we need to study why it didn't work? Yes, I mean, stop talking about the Soviet Union. Really, just stop. Let's look at the great experiments in the global south. Let's look at the great theorists in the global south. Because they've been thinking about these issues for over 100 years. And it's time that, if you'll forgive me, white people stop just focusing on, what the white people did that was all fucked up. I mean, really, stop. And then I think we will see that there are very different theories of the state out there.
That's right.
Some of which you can embrace, some of which you want to criticize. But really, we need to expand. That's your point. Marx taught us a lot about what's the problem with capitalism. Once we get beyond that and we start thinking about what it would be to be socialist, we have no idea. And Luxemburg said, all we can do is have the widest form of participatory democracy and experiments in creativity that we can begin to imagine.
Thank you. I think we're coming close to being out of time. I will just point out Brooklyn Institute has classes on Rosa Luxemburg and Franz Fanon, but not Lenin. And we don't, no Trotsky course either. God, someone's going to write me angry emails now. I just want to thank again. I know there's more to say here, and you all are invited to stick around for our reception on behalf of the Goethe-Institut and Brooklyn Institute. But this is not the end of a conversation. This is the beginning of a conversation that we're going to be having this weekend and beyond. So I do hope everyone, some of us up here, some of you down here, come back tomorrow. Literally every topic discussed up here will be discussed in further depth and expanded with more ideas and more reference and more voices included. So with that, thank you again to this panel, and thank you all for coming. And happy birthday, Uncle Carl.